At 7:49 a.m., the First Wave's commander ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor to proceed. 6 minutes later, the coordinated attack on Pearl Harbor began. The Japanese dropped bombs, torpedoes, and fired mercilessly at the Pacific Fleet and aircraft bases. Dive bombers attacked American air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main United States Army Air Force's fighter base.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas.
What if Japan had gone to war in December of 1941 and the United States simply wasn't part of it? What if the newspapers that landed on American doorsteps that Monday morning had reported a Japanese invasion of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, thousands of miles from any American territory, and most of the country had genuinely been able to shrug and turn the page? What if Pearl Harbor had stayed a quiet naval base in a country that was still technically at peace? Because here's the thing people miss about the attack on Pearl Harbor. It wasn't the only plan on the table in Tokyo. It was the plan one man fought hardest for against real internal resistance, and if that argument had gone even slightly differently, the entire shape of American involvement in World War II changes. So, quick recap. By the summer of 1941, Japan is stuck. It's been fighting a grinding, unwinnable war in China since 1937, a war that's eating enormous amounts of oil, rubber, and steel that Japan has almost none of domestically. Nearly 80% of Japan's oil comes from the United States. When Japan occupies southern French Indochina in July of 1941, positioning itself to move against British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies next, Roosevelt responds by freezing Japanese assets and, alongside Britain and the Dutch government in exile, cutting off oil exports entirely. It's an embargo that puts a countdown clock on Japan's entire war machine. Without a new source of oil, the Imperial Navy's reserves start running out within about 2 years, and considerably faster if it's actually fighting anyone. The oil Japan needs sits in the Dutch East Indies, and taking it means going to war with the colonial powers who control it. That part of the plan is basically settled by the autumn of 1941. The argument that isn't settled is what to do about the United States. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who has lived in America, studied at Harvard, and understands its industrial capacity better than almost anyone else in the Japanese military, believes there's no way to seize British and Dutch territory in Southeast Asia without eventually dragging in the United States, because American bases in the Philippines sit directly across Japan's supply lines back from the Indies, and because he doesn't believe Washington will simply watch its British and Dutch allies get overrun without acting. His argument, one he makes forcefully and repeatedly to a Navy leadership that isn't fully convinced, is that if war with America is coming regardless, Japan's only chance is a knockout blow against the Pacific Fleet at the start, buying 6 months to a year to build an unbreakable defensive perimeter before American industrial power turns the war irreversible. He says this part almost word for word to colleagues, that Japan can run wild for 6 months to a year, but has no chance whatsoever in a long war. Not everyone agrees with him. Voices within the Japanese army, less invested in the naval side of the plan and more focused purely on securing the resource-rich colonies to the south, argue for a narrower operation, seize Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, leave the Philippines and Hawaii alone entirely, and gamble that an American public still overwhelmingly opposed to entering another foreign war, per the America First Committee and a Congress that only narrowly extended the draft a few months earlier by a single vote, will not go to war over colonies that belong to Britain and the Netherlands rather than to itself. There's one more piece of the real background worth sitting with before we break this, because it explains why the Army's narrower view was never some fringe position. Japan and the Soviet Union signed a neutrality pact in April of 1941 just 2 months before Germany invaded Russia, and the Japanese army, having been badly blooded by Soviet forces under Georgy Zhukov at the battles of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, had no appetite left for a two-front war against both the Soviets in the north and the Western powers in the south. Every resource the army commits to a wider Pacific war against the United States is a resource it can't hold in reserve against the Soviet Union that could, in theory, tear up that neutrality pact whenever it found the moment convenient. From the army's perspective, keeping the United States out of the equation entirely isn't caution for its own sake. It's the only way the math of a two-ocean, two-continent empire even begins to work. Yamamoto wins that internal argument, and Pearl Harbor happens. So here's our divergence. What if he doesn't? What if the Army's narrower view carries the day in the Imperial General Headquarters liaison conferences of November 1941 and Japan launches its southern operation against Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies, while leaving the Philippines, Guam, and Pearl Harbor completely untouched, betting everything on American restraint? The initial military picture doesn't actually change all that much, at least at first, because Japan's advantages over the British and Dutch forces in Southeast Asia were real and didn't depend on Pearl Harbor to exist. Singapore, defended by a garrison that historically surrendered to a Japanese force it dramatically outnumbered because its defences faced the sea rather than the jungle approach from the north, falls in early 1942, largely on the same timeline it did historically. The Dutch East Indies, poorly defended and geographically indefensible against a determined Japanese advance, follow the same way. Hong Kong falls to a Japanese assault by Christmas Day, the same as it did historically, a small British garrison overwhelmed within about 2 weeks, and there's no American declaration of war for anyone to point to as the moment everything changed. Manila and the Philippines, left conspicuously untouched, become the strangest place on the map in December of 1941, an American territory sitting less than 1,000 miles from the fighting, home to General Douglas MacArthur and a growing garrison of American and Filipino troops, and yet completely at peace, watching a war unfold just over the horizon that it has no legal footing to join. MacArthur, by every account of his temperament we have, is not a man who takes well to sitting on the sidelines, and he spends these months lobbying Washington furiously for authorization to intervene, arguing that Japan's restraint is temporary and that waiting for an attack that may never come, precisely aimed at American soil, is strategically insane. Washington, for now, holds him back, and what's different is the reaction 6,000 miles away in Washington itself. Roosevelt has spent 2 years trying to move an isolationist country toward confronting fascism through Lend-Lease, through increasingly aggressive naval patrols in the Atlantic, through economic pressure on Japan. He wants to help Britain and the Dutch government in exile now that their colonies are under direct attack. And privately, he believes American involvement in the wider war is inevitable eventually. But he also understands something basic about democratic politics that Yamamoto understood about American industry. You cannot take a country to war over an attack on someone else's territory, not when that country just spent the 1930s passing a series of neutrality acts specifically designed to keep it out of exactly this situation. Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, already a mass movement with rallies drawing tens of thousands, have an easy, devastatingly effective argument now. Why should American boys die for the British Empire and Dutch colonies in a jungle nobody in Ohio has heard of? Roosevelt can send ships, planes, and money, and he does, expanding Lend-Lease to cover the fight against Japan the same way it already covers Britain and the Soviet Union. What he cannot do, at least not yet, is get a declaration of war through a Congress with no attack on American soil or American forces to point to. Roosevelt tries anyway, going before Congress in the days after the Southern operation, begins to argue that an unchecked Japan controlling the resources and shipping lanes of the entire Western Pacific is a direct long-term threat to American security, whether or not a single American base has been touched. It's a serious, well-reasoned argument, and it still isn't enough. Isolationist senators, the same bloc that fought Lend-Lease itself tooth and nail before it passed by a narrow margin in March of 1941, point out accurately that Roosevelt is asking the country to die for the defense of the British and Dutch empires, and public opinion polling, which historically ran heavily against intervention right up until the morning of December 7th, does not move nearly far enough on its own. The vote, if it's even brought to the floor, fails or passes only for a limited authorization to defend American territory and shipping rather than a full declaration of war against Japan. Roosevelt is left doing the only thing he can, expanding aid, expanding the Navy's presence in the Pacific under the framework of defending American interests, and waiting for the incident that will finally give him what the floor of the Senate is refusing to hand him voluntarily. Inside this waiting period, the propaganda war matters as much as the shooting one. Japanese diplomats work hard to keep the narrative framed as a war of liberation from European colonialism, and it lands with at least some sympathy in parts of the American press and among anti-imperialist voices who have never had much love for the British Raj or the Dutch East Indies in the first place. That argument gets much harder to sustain once reports start filtering back from Hong Kong and Malaya of what Japanese occupation actually looks like on the ground. And by the second half of 1942, the moral case for staying out is eroding even as the strict legal case, no attack on American soil, remains stubbornly intact. It's a genuinely uncomfortable position for a president who believes, correctly as it turns out, that his country's security is already at stake, but who cannot make a democracy go to war faster than its own Congress and its own public are willing to move. And this is the part of the divergence that actually reshapes the entire war, not just the Pacific. Historically, Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, an act of alliance loyalty to Japan that, in hindsight, is one of the most consequential unforced errors any leader made in the entire war, because it handed Roosevelt a two-front war he otherwise would have had to talk Congress into far more slowly. Take Pearl Harbor away, and there's no American ships or sailors killed to point to, no galvanizing photograph of Arizona sinking, and critically, no reason for Hitler to declare war on a country that hasn't attacked anyone yet. Germany and the United States, in this timeline, can remain in an undeclared shadow war in the Atlantic, American destroyers already skirmishing with German U-boats, escorting convoys without ever crossing into a formal state of war, which means the United States, for however long this lasts, isn't fighting in Europe either. Lend-Lease keeps flowing to Britain and the Soviet Union. American factories keep retooling for war production, because Roosevelt keeps pushing preparedness regardless, but there is no American expeditionary force being planned, no build-up in Britain toward an eventual invasion of France, and absolutely no timeline yet for anything resembling D-Day. How long can that actually hold? Realistically, not forever. And I don't think this timeline gets to avoid American entry altogether, just delayed and reshaped. Japanese submarines operating in the Pacific inevitably start hitting American merchant shipping supplying the Philippines and Australia, because a war economy that large doesn't stay neatly contained to British and Dutch territory for long, and each incident puts more pressure on Congress. Meanwhile, the humanitarian toll of a Southeast Asia campaign fought without any American check at all is severe enough, and eventually visible enough. War correspondents already understood in 1941 how to make atrocity stories land back home that public opinion likely shifts within a year regardless. My honest read is that America still ends up in this war by sometime in 1943, but as a country that entered through a slow accumulation of incidents and moral pressure rather than a single galvanizing morning, and that changes the emotional character of the whole war effort. There's no Pearl Harbor to put on recruitment posters, no single date that every American who lived through it can recite from memory. The unity that historically got manufactured almost overnight in December of 1941 has to be built the hard, slow way, instead argument by argument, ship by sunk ship. For the war itself, an extra year or more of American industrial capacity flowing only into Lend-Lease rather than into its own deployed armies means Britain and the Soviet Union carry a heavier direct combat burden for longer, with American material support but without American divisions on the ground in North Africa or eventually in France. The Eastern Front, already the main event of the entire war, becomes even more overwhelmingly the place where Germany's army gets ground down because there's no torch landing in North Africa in late 1942, pulling German divisions away from Russia, at least not on schedule. Stalin, who historically distrusted his allies' commitment to a second front and pressed relentlessly for one starting in 1942, has every reason to distrust them even more in this timeline, and the post-war relationship between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, already heading toward the Cold War regardless, starts from an even deeper well of resentment about who actually did the dying while the war was being won. And for Japan, that 6-month to 1-year window Yamamoto was so afraid of squandering doesn't just shrink, it gets replaced with something almost as dangerous in a different way: more time. More time to consolidate the resource-rich territories it seized. More time to fortify the defensive perimeter it always knew it needed, and more time before an American war machine that Yamamoto correctly understood as unstoppable once fully mobilized actually turns its full attention toward the Pacific. Whether that additional runway ultimately saves the Japanese Empire or just delays and worsens its eventual collapse is honestly the open question this whole scenario leaves hanging, because industrial capacity doesn't care how patient you are. It just keeps compounding, quietly, in the background, waiting for the war to finally arrive at your doorstep. There's a longer shadow here too, one that stretches all the way to 1945, regardless of exactly when America formally enters. The Manhattan Project doesn't depend on Pearl Harbor to exist. It's already being seeded by British and American physicists worried about German nuclear research well before December of 1941, and it proceeds on roughly its own internal timeline either way. What changes is the political and emotional context the weapon eventually gets used inside. Historically, the bomb landed at the end of a war that America entered through a single searing act of aggression against its own people, which shaped how easily the decision to use it against Japanese cities got made and accepted at home. A war that America backed into slowly through accumulation of incidents and moral pressure rather than one unmistakable act of treachery produces a different domestic mood by 1945, one with more room for the war weariness and second-guessing that historically got mostly steamrolled by the memory of that one Sunday morning. Whether that makes the bomb more or less likely to be used or used differently against different targets on a different timetable is genuinely hard to say, but it's not nothing, because the emotional temperature a country carries into its worst decisions rarely comes from the strategic briefing. It comes from whatever it still remembers feeling on the day the war became personal. There's also the matter of what an unattacked Pacific Fleet means for the shape of the eventual American campaign once the war does arrive. Historically, the losses at Pearl Harbor, brutal as they were, fell almost entirely on the fleet's battleships, ships that were already becoming secondary to naval air power, and that the Navy, in a strange twist, arguably didn't miss as much as feared once carrier warfare proved decisive at Midway. A fleet that never gets hit at all keeps its battleships, its cruisers, and crucially keeps thousands of experienced sailors alive who historically died in the harbour that morning. When the United States does eventually enter this war, it enters with a materially stronger starting position in the Pacific than it actually had in early 1942, which could compress the years-long island-hopping campaign that historically ground forward from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, or could simply shift where the first major clash with the Imperial Navy happens. Japan, for its part, still has to defend an enormous, resource-hungry perimeter stretching from Burma to the Solomons the moment America finally does arrive, and a fleet that shows up intact and unprovoked rather than one that shows up furious and improvising is, if anything, a worse strategic problem for Tokyo to solve, not a better one. What I keep coming back to with this one is how much of December 7th wasn't really about America at all. It was a Japanese Navy officer at a conference table in Tokyo winning an argument against his own army about whether the United States could be safely ignored. Pearl Harbor didn't happen because Japan wanted war with America for its own sake. It happened because one admiral was more afraid of leaving that fleet intact than he was of everything it would cost to destroy it. Lose that argument in Tokyo and the war doesn't start smaller. It just starts somewhere else, on a schedule nobody in Washington gets to choose.